Hi, this is Juneri, BPI economist. I'm posting this video in relation to a tweet I made earlier today, which is in relation to inflation, and whether it is the CPI inflation, which is currently being published by the Philippine Statistics Authority, is understated or overstated. No? Because apparently there is someone claiming that our analysis that it is understated is wrong. Okay, so to analyze that, well, let's look at the following outline that we prepared today. Um, First and foremost, this is the tweet that we made this morning, and it seems that very few, except probably the national statistician and other more technical analysts, were able to understand. No? It's very crucial because inflation in the Philippines is actually the second highest in Southeast Asia today, at a time when the policy rate is one of the lowest because the Bangko Sentral had cut the policy rate by a total of 175 basis points so far this year, and is now actually, the policy rate now is actually below the inflation rate again. No? And so very important to address this question because again, inflation is supposedly going down and it's getting closer to the policy rate. And so it's important to settle whether this is really an understated computation or not. So to answer this, we will cover three areas. First, what are the alternative computations for inflation, aside from the usual CPI, which is what the Bangko Sentral also uses. Number two, let's look at which is probably more appropriate for a pandemic environment. And then part three, let's look at the actual numbers for 2Q 2020, and we'll share with you our view for 3Q 2020 as well for the difference between the two methodologies. So I'll start off with our CPI inflation, the one that the Bangko Sentral uses for its inflation targeting framework, and something that the PSA submits every month or reports every month, no? Usually every first week of the following month. What you now see is are the weights for CPI for the Philippines, which was recently set at 2018. No? CPI was set at 100 in 2018, and these are the weights for the different commodities. No? Now, when you compute for CPI inflation, the prices change for each commodity, but the weights in the index do not change. They are constant. That's what we mean by fixed weights, no? In contrast to what we call chain-weighted computation of inflation. A chain-weighted way of computing for inflation, one way of doing that is using the HFCE or the PCE deflator, which you clearly see changes through time. What you see in this chart is the 10-year average for HFCE deflator and the weights of the different commodity items over the past 10 years and comparing them with the second quarter of 2020. So it's very clear, no? Food changed significantly from 32%, 35% of the total to 42% during the pandemic, and so on and so forth. Now, people practically did not have any demand for transportation in the second quarter of 2020, precisely because of the quarantine measures. It's very, so I think the weights are more representative of what people are really spending on. Now, it's important to also know that the use of a deflator, a chain-weighted deflator, meaning the weights change depending on what people consume at that particular time, in contrast to weights that are based on a fixed period, which we have identified so far as, or most recently as 2018, could be a better representative of realities. No? And in the US in particular, they use core PCE deflator. No, the Federal Reserve uses the core PCE deflator as its target in its in its formulation of monetary policy. No, more recently, they set it at 2%. That 2% is based on the core PCE deflator, not on CPI fixed rate inflation. Okay, so again, just to summarize, the difference between the two, the deflator, HFCE deflator, and CPI inflation, is that the weights for the PCE deflator changes depending on what people spend on. Whereas CPI inflation is based on a base year, okay? And they fix the weight of each commodity item on what people were spending on the basket they were spending on the year that was chosen. In our case, in the Philippines, is 2018. Okay, and of course, there's a difference of the frequency of data release. Unfortunately, while they monitor, I think, PCE deflator in the US on a monthly basis, in the Philippines, it's only monitored on a quarterly. So we're done with part one. We'll now cover which we think is better for a COVID-19 environment. This chart shows you a very compelling story. The first time in our history, and I never thought I will see it in my lifetime, the consumption behavior saw a negative 16% drop in the second quarter of 2020. In this kind of an environment, it seems to make less sense to use a fixed weight for your CPI basket or for your price basket or your consumer basket, because it's clearly different. The items that we spend on during a pandemic are clearly different clearly different consumer items. And this chart even makes that point even more compelling, because you see that demand for restaurants dropped by almost 2/3 of total. Demand for recreation and culture, more than 1/2. Transportation, only less than 40% than the usual demand for transportation. Okay, so this kind of behavior means there should be less weight on products that affect the consumer when they consume less of it. Okay, and there should be more weight on items that they consume more. Whereas a fixed weight CPI inflation doesn't factor that in. They just think that 2018 is the same as 2020. Clearly not the case. Again, I showed you this table earlier, this chart earlier, and you can see that there's a big difference between the weights of what households spent on over the past 10 years compared to the last quarter. Okay, so for us, a chain-weighted way of computing for inflation is much, much better. Now we move to part three. What do the numbers actually show for the second quarter of 2020 between CPI inflation and HFCE deflator inflation? And then what's our guess or what's our estimate for the third quarter of 2020? Okay, so these are the actual numbers for CPI inflation, and it's going down. Some people are saying it's understated. It's overstated. We are saying it's understated. Okay, now, what do the actual numbers show? No, in the second quarter, HFCE deflator shows a 2.8% inflation rate, whereas CPI inflation is only 2.3. Okay, so it's clear, okay, that the CPI inflation is understated by 0.5 percentage point. Okay, and our estimate is that in the third quarter of 2020, it will be the same. It's because of the changing composition of demand. No? More precisely, if you look at the swing in the price of oil, no? During the second quarter, particularly during the months of April, May, the contribution of oil was negative. The contribution of transport was negative. And then it swings to plus 0.5, 0.7 through September. What does that mean? That's about a 1 percentage to 1.2 percentage point swing in the contribution of transport to CPI. Okay? Now, it's very clear in a fixed weight, no, that they will contribute this much. But under a chain-weighted computation, we know that in April and May, these declines in transport costs should not have been factored in because people were not using transportation during the pandemic, during the quarantine period. Whereas now we are slowly consuming more of it. and the price is going up. So the price is going up for the items that we are consuming more of. Okay? Compared to the time that we were consuming less, well, 40%, 60% less transportation, the price was going down. Now that we're moving towards more normal transportation use, the contribution has swung from minus 0.5 to plus 0.5, which is a 1 percentage point swing. Okay, so the change plus the increasing weight of the use of transportation means most likely that the third quarter inflation numbers using HFCE deflator and computing for inflation using that deflator would have been much, much higher. Take a look at the food component. The food component, of course, probably didn't change much, but probably shrank. Okay? The contribution clearly from CPI inflation declined, but the swing is not as big as the swing of transport. Although the weight of food is bigger, the swing is not as obvious. So just on the basis of that, we believe the third quarter CPI inflation will continue to understate the real inflation environment in the Philippines. Okay, and this is why we tweeted this towards the end. Okay, with that, I'd like to end my presentation and thank everyone for spending some time to listen to it. Thank you.